The most dangerous piece of writing advice is not something technical like show don't tell. It's the seductive lie that you should simply discover the story as you go. Now, if you're just looking for a quick hack to finish a blind novel, then please click away, because this is a deep dive into a particular flawed advice that has resulted in countless writers being punished with a folder of failed drafts. A folder that keeps getting heavier and heavier. You see, what you've been sold as the beauty of creative freedom is in fact a direct cause of the structural paralysis that plagues so many aspiring authors. And the problem I'm referring to is especially catastrophic for us as fantasy writers. Why? Because we're not writing a quiet domestic drama set in a single kitchen. We are juggling world histories, intricate magic systems, sprawling casts of characters, and the deep thematic resonance that the genre demands. To attempt this level of creation by simply discovering it as you go is not an act of artistic bravery. It is an act of architectural malpractice. Trust me, I know how it goes. You have a story's core image that haunts you, like a silver throne in a forest of bone or a ship sailing on a sea of sand. You open a new document, you name it something ambitious like Dragonheart Master version 1, and you begin. Your hero takes the first steps and the world begins to come alive. The first 20, maybe 30,000 words fly from your fingertips. And this, you think, is what it feels like to be a real writer. But then you hit the inevitable wall. The plot threads you started with such confidence now feel like a tangled mess of yarn. You have a dozen interesting characters, but no idea how their journeys are supposed to intersect. And when you sit down to write now, your life already a chaotic collection of what I call time confetti, you spend your precious 30 minutes just rereading the last chapter, trying to remember what the point was. So you close it, telling yourself you just need a break, to let the subconscious work on it. But days turn into weeks, and your masterpiece in progress is now just another ghost haunting that folder of failed drafts. You see, what happened here is the experience of narrative entropy, the inevitable decay of a story that lacks a structural spine. The lie about discovering the story as you go infers that this feeling of paralysis is a personal failure, that you lack the talent, the discipline, or the magic of the greats. But this is the most insidious part of the myth. It takes a systemic problem of process and reframes it as your individual inadequacy. But the problem isn't you. The problem is the intellectual framework you've been given. For decades, we've been presented with a false premise, a toxic choice between two flawed identities. On one side, you have the intuitive artist, the free-spirited gardener who trusts the muse and lets the story grow organically. On the other, you have the rigid plotter, the meticulous architect who lays out every brick based on predetermined beat sheets that are completely void of any emotional substance. More often than not, we're told that you must choose here, that you are either one or the other. And because you're a creative person, because you cherish the magic of discovery, you might have been encouraged to embrace the Gardner model. To make it even more seductive, this advice comes with its own patron saints, such as Stephen King and George R. R. Martin. King, in On Writing, famously describes his process as unearthing a fossil, starting with a situation and characters, then discovering the story by seeing how they honestly behave. But for those who here only don't plot, and ignore the deep character and situational work that approach requires, this becomes a profound and dangerous misunderstanding of King's genius. Because you see, it can be argued that what appears to be pure intuition from these masters is, more accurately, the result of decades of internalized, weaponized craft operating at a level most of us cannot perceive. King and Martin are not working without a blueprint. Their blueprint is etched onto their very literary DNA, through thousands of hours of practice. They have an innate subconscious command of structure that most of us have not yet had the time to build. So following their stated process without their decades of experience is like trying to flying a Boeing 747 because you read a quote from a pilot who said he just feels the wind. It is a blueprint for failure. Which brings us to the central questions of our work today. If the process of King and Martin leads to masterpiece after masterpiece, why does the imitation of that process lead so many aspiring authors to a folder of dead documents? What is the missing piece of the puzzle, and how can you avoid the pitfalls? Well, the answer is that many writers are not suffering from a lack of creativity, or a lack of talent, or even a lack of discipline. They are suffering from a specific diagnosable condition I call blueprint deficiency. These writers, which might include yourself, have been taught to conflate the feeling of discovery, which is essential, with an absence of architecture, which is fatal. So it's time to deconstruct the myth of the effortless genius and replace it with the empowering reality of deliberated craft. Now, to understand why this flawed advice has such a powerful hold on you, you have to understand that it isn't new. It's not a product of the internet age or modern publishing. It is the ghost of an idea born over 200 years ago that has been haunting the minds of artists ever since. To find its source, you have to travel back in time with me, much further even than the 1970s fantasy boom. We have to go all the way back to the turn of the 19th century. This was the era of the Great Romantic Movement, a seismic intellectual and artistic rebellion against the cold clockwork logic of the Enlightenment that had preceded it. The Romantics championed the individual. They celebrated intense, overwhelming emotion, the awe-inspiring power of nature, and the sanctity of pure, untamed imagination. And this movement had its own patron saints and poets like William Wordsworth or Samuel Taylor Coleridge. The popular image of these figures, the one that has been passed down and simplified for centuries, is one of almost mystical creation. You have the image of Wordsworth wandering through the Lake District, seeing a field of daffodils and, in a flash of divine inspiration, spontaneously composing a perfect poem. Or you have the even more potent myth of Coleridge, who, after taking laudanum, falls into a deep sleep and dreams his masterpiece Kubla Khan, a fantastical vision of Xanadu, complete and fully formed. Coleridge awakens and simply transcribes the vision that was gifted to him from the ether. This is the origin story. This is the birthplace of the myth that great art is not built but received. That the artist is not a craftsman but a conduit, a passive vessel for a lightning strike of genius. But with that said, I can already hear you shouting at the screen. Okay, Sasha, this is a fascinating detour into poetry. But what on earth does this have to do with the fact that I cannot figure out the plot twist in my epic fantasy trilogy? And the answer to this is everything. Because the story so many aspiring writers tell themselves about their own creative process, the shame they feel when it's hard, the belief that it should be effortless, this is a direct inherited echo of these simplified stories of creative genius. You see, here's the part of the history lesson that gets left out in those simplified versions. The image of Wordsworth as a spontaneous wanderer, for example, is a romantic fiction. In 1800, Wordsworth wrote a dense, highly technical and deeply philosophical essay called The Preface to Lyrical Ballads. This was more akin to a manifesto than a poem. It was an architectural blueprint for his entire artistic movement. In it, Wordsworth defines poetry with a precision that would make an engineer proud. He famously states that poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. It takes its origin from emotion recollected in tranquility. Now, listen to that last crucial part again. Recollected in tranquility. The spontaneous overflow he talks about is just the raw material. It's the initial spark, the haunting core image of your story. But the art, the actual craft of making the poem happens later. It happens when the artist sits down, away from the heat of the moment, and deliberately, consciously architects a structure to house that emotion. Wordsworth was not a passive conduit. He was a meticulous theorist who spent years refining his craft and articulating its underlying principles. The case of his friend Coleridge is even more damning to the myth of just discovering the story. Far from being a simple dreamer waiting for opium-fueled visions, Coleridge was one of the most brilliant and frankly most complex literary critics who ever lived. His major work of prose, the Biographia Literaria, is a labyrinth of philosophical inquiry into the very mechanics of human imagination. He obsessively categorized the creative faculties, drawing a sharp distinction between what he called fancy, the simple reassembling of existing images, and the secondary imagination, which he described as a godlike power that dissolves, diffuses, dissipates in order to recreate. This is not the language of a man who just lets it flow. This is a language of a systems builder. A man trying to reverse engineer the engine of creation itself. As famous as his poem Kubla Khan became, the truth is far more instructive when it comes to the pitfalls of relying on inspiration alone. Because according to Coleridge's own account, his poem Kubla Khan is a brilliant, haunting, and utterly unfinished fragment. He stated himself that it's a brilliant beginning born from an opium-infused dream, collapsed into nothing when he was interrupted and the vision was lost. Whether a literal event or a literary framing device, the story of Kubla Khan has become one of history's greatest metaphors for the fragility of pure inspiration, how it can shatter when it lacks a resilient structure to survive the inevitable interruption of the real world. Your own version of such distraction is your day job, your kids, your limited energy, the sheer cognitive load of holding a fantasy world in your head. Without a blueprint, the moment that initial dreamlike vision is interrupted, it will shatter, and it rarely comes back. So you see, there is a link between those romantic poets and your fantasy novel. Because it is no different when it comes to the modern reliance on effortless flow while writing something as massive as a fantasy novel. The problem is that the complex, messy truth of these poets' lives, the manifestos, the theories, the revisions, the fragments, that wasn't a good story. The myth was better and simpler. The myth was more romantic. So the myth is what survived, and over time it has completely overshadowed the laborious reality of their craft, leaving your folder of failed drafts paying the price. But leaving the poets behind us, how does the romantic myth of the Athletic Genius, a ghost from 2 centuries ago, reach across time to sabotage your fantasy novel today? Well, it does so by finding new hosts. It finds its modern voice in the simplified, decontextualized advice of our own contemporary masters. Now, before I move on, let me be absolutely clear here. The problem in of itself is not Stephen King or George R. R. Martin. These are brilliant authors who have, through decades of relentless work, earned the right to whatever process serves them. The real enemy is not the person, it is the myth that has been constructed around their success. It's the way their advice is weaponized to validate a path that for the vast majority of writers leads directly to the abyss. When you hear King's famous analogy about the story being a fossil in the ground that you just dig up, you're not hearing the full story. What gets left out is that before King discusses his fossil analogy, he dedicates a crucial section of his book on writing to building a writer's toolbox. In this section, he gives an exhaustive, deeply practical manual on the fundamentals of the craft, including vocabulary, grammar, and paragraph construction. He is, in effect, telling you how to be a master craftsman before he ever gets to the more philosophical discussion of finding the story. Now, some people might say here, but King explicitly advises against plotting. In his book, he says, the last resort of the amateur and the struggling writer is the plot outline. And my answer to this is that you have been encouraged to listen to the surface noise, while ignoring the underlying depth. The depth of King's work is his absolute uncompromising devotion to the fundamentals of the craft. What so many perceive as him driving without a map is in fact a master driving with such an internalized knowledge of the roads, the engine, and the laws of physics that the map has become secondary. King is not discovering a story in a vacuum. He's applying a lifetime of accumulated structural knowledge at an intuitive, subconscious speed. To hear his advice to just write and ignore his rigorous insistence on the toolbox is a catastrophic misreading. It's like listening to a grandmaster concert pianist say they just feel the music and concluding that you should therefore never practice your scales. It's absurd. When you strip the master's advice of its context, the decades of practice, the thousands of hours of study, the deep internalized knowledge of structure, it ceases to be a philosophy of craft and becomes a permission slip for chaos. A state I call narrative anarchy. It gives a seductive intellectual justification for the most destructive possible approach to a complex project. I see this all the time in the Tale Tinkers Atelier, our exclusive writing community. When I review student blueprints, more often than not, the writer isn't suffering from a lack of ideas. They are suffering from a structural collapse. Narrative anarchy is a direct consequence of taking the romantic myth of the Athletic Genius at face value. It is the attempt to create a work of immense architectural complexity without a blueprint, by trying to invent your plot, discover your character arcs, build your world, establish your themes, and write beautiful prose all at the same time. Imagine trying to build a cathedral this way. You show up at the quarry on Monday and spontaneously decide to carve a gargoyle, with no idea where it will go on the finished building. On Tuesday, you feel inspired to craft a single perfect stained glass window. On Wednesday, you dig a trench for a foundation, but you don't know the final dimensions of the building, so you're just guessing. At the end of the week, you have a pile of beautiful disconnected fragments, but you do not have a cathedral. At best, you have a stunning, disconnected ruin. This is what is happening inside your draft if you're not careful. Taking the flawed advice of discovering the story as you go at face value, more often than not will lead you into a state of narrative anarchy. In it, you write a fascinating subplot about a thieves guild or invent a new core cast character, but you have no architectural plan that dictates how it must connect to your protagonist's core emotional journey. So your creative spark just sits there, a beautifully carved gargoyle lying in the mud. This is why you hit the wall when it comes to your novel, the ultimate source that causes structural paralysis. Now, sticking to the metaphor of building a cathedral, your brain, which has a finite amount of cognitive capacity, is being asked to perform the job of a stonemason, a glassblower, a theologian, a structural engineer, and a project manager all at once. The system you rely on to write the novel, what little structure there is, inevitably collapses under that strain. But that feeling of being lost in the middle of your own story is not you failing. It is the inevitable consequence of narrative anarchy, leading to the system failing you. It is not the other way around. You see, the myth of Affluent Genius tells you that structure is a prison, that a plan will kill the magic and stifle your intuition. But this is the most profound inversion of the truth. True creative freedom, true living motion, does not exist in the absence of constraints. It is born from them. A river is only a river because it has banks. Without banks, it is not a powerful, flowing, life-giving force. It is a swamp, a stagnant, sprawling, and directionless bog. So you see, the banks do not imprison the river. They give it its power, its speed, its direction, its very identity. And the structure of your novel, the blueprint, that is the banks. It is the vessel that contains the chaotic, beautiful, overwhelming energy of your initial inspiration and channels it into a powerful, propulsive narrative force. What I'm saying here is that art is not chaos. Art is the intelligent ordering of chaos. The 14 lines of a sonnet are not a cage, they are the pressure vessel that transforms feeling into timeless poetry. The rules of a magic system are not limitations. They are what make the magic meaningful, what creates stakes and drama. Just take a look how you define a hero in a story. The hero who can do anything is boring. The hero who is limited, who must make hard choices within a rigid set of constraints, that is the hero you cannot look away from. By making the big architectural decisions ahead of time, such as what is this story about emotionally? What is the irreversible transformation the hero must undergo? Where does this journey end? You liberate your creative mind during the act of drafting. You free it from the crushing cognitive load of narrative anarchy by giving it the safety and confidence to focus on the moment, to discover the perfect line of dialogue, and to feel the character's heartbeat in the scene. So with that said, let's move from the abstract to the forensic. Let's put a narrative on the table and conduct an autopsy. I want to show you in concrete terms what the pathology of narrative anarchy looks like on the page. Now, what you're about to see is a made-up composite, drawn from all kinds of stories I've analyzed. Imagine our hero, a young man named Tobin, in a tavern with his grizzled mentor, an old mercenary named Brenna. The text reads like this. Tobin stared into his ale. "I don't understand, Brenna. Why me?" Brenna leaned forward, her voice low. "Because the prophecy of the Crimson Heralds foretold your coming. 100 years ago, during the Sundering War, the Oracle of Grey Peak spoke of a boy with a serpent birthmark. She said he alone could reunite the 3 fragments of the Ethereum Shard, an artifact forged by the Elder Kings to imprison the shadow god Vorlach." Brenna pushed a small cloth-wrapped object across the table. "You must take this. It is the map to the first fragment's resting place in the sunken city. The agents of the Black Priory are already looking for it. You must leave tonight." Tobin looked down at the object, then back at Brenna. "But I'm just a stable hand." "You are much more than that," Brenna said. "You have a destiny to fulfill." Now, let's stop here. On the surface, this is functional. It sets up a quest, it has a prophecy, a magic artifact, and a secret destiny. In theory, it checks all the fantasy boxes. And yet, if you ask me, it is completely lifeless. This is the literary equivalent of a flatline. The issue lies not in purple prose or flawed grammar here. The failure is not on the sentence level at all. It's on the architectural level. This scene reads as if it were written by an author discovering the plot as they go. The reliance on exposition over character-driven action is a common outcome when a writer is trying to invent complex world building and advance the plot simultaneously, because the cognitive load can lead to favoring the most direct solutions. Let me show you the deeper problems here. First, look at the protagonist Tobin. Notice his first line of dialogue. "Why me?" Tobin is entirely passive. He's a vessel for the plot to happen to. In fact, Tobin doesn't make a single choice in this entire exchange. He asks a question, receives an info dump, is given an object, and is told what to do. He's a passenger in his own story. And this is the first and most critical symptom of blueprint deficiency, because the writer has no architectural plan for Tobin's internal journey. No defined flaw he must overcome, no core misbelief that drives his decisions. The character himself has no engine. He's just waiting for the writer to figure out what happens to him, and most often this results in over-reliance on external plot elements. Now, next then, examine Brenna. She's basically a Wikipedia article. Her dialogue is a textbook example of what happens when you mistake data for drama. The prophecy of the Crimson Heralds, the Sundering War, the Oracle of Grey Peak, the Ethereum Shards, the Elder Kings, Vorlach. This is a classic symptom of the world builder's trap, which is a direct byproduct of narrative anarchy. The author, inspired by their own cool lore, is trying to build the world and advance the plot simultaneously. The result is that neither job gets done well. This dialogue does not reveal character, it does not create tension, it does not even contain subtext. At its core, this is nothing but a brute force injection of exposition. Within all this text, we learn nothing about Brenna's relationship with Tobin, her fears for him, or the personal cost of this quest to her. But this isn't even the most telling detail in this example scene. Consider one of the last lines again. You must take this. This is narrative impotence, disguised as urgency. The drama in any scene comes from conflict, and conflict is born from opposing desires. For this moment to have any power, Tobin would need a powerful reason to refuse the call. Perhaps he believes his duty is to care for his ailing mother. Perhaps he's a coward who has never left his village. Anything at all that is rooted in him as an actual person. But because the writer has no blueprint for Tobin's internal state, there is no counter-argument and thus no friction. We only get this smooth, lifeless delivery of a plot point. And these risks can be amplified during an event like NaNoWriMo, the National Novel Writing Month, a popular annual challenge for writers to draft a 50,000-word novel in November. While the exercise is brilliant for silencing your inner critic, if a writer undertakes it without a plan, essentially in a state of narrative anarchy, they risk spending a month practicing and reinforcing these exact architectural failures. You learn to write more, yes, but you don't necessarily learn to write better. Worst case, you are just getting faster at writing failed drafts. The fundamental problem with this example scene, and the thousands of drafts just like it gathering dust in folders around the world, is that it was created on an unsustainable cognitive load. It's the poor result of someone trying to invent the plot, the world history, the character arc, and the prose on a single Tuesday afternoon. The brain, faced with this impossible task, more often than not defaults to cliché. It reaches for the easiest, most well-worn path. At its core, this is a coping mechanism of the brain, trying to reduce the overwhelming cognitive strain. Which basically means the entire scene is a casualty of a broken process that leads back to the myth of the effortless genius. Because a professional working with a blueprint would have known the answers to the architectural questions before writing a single word of this scene. They would know that Tobin's core flaw is a deep-seated shame about his impoverished background, making him desperate for respect. They would know the scene's primary purpose is to force Tobin to make his first active choice, to steal the money his family saved for the winter to buy passage on a ship, believing this quest is his only shot at becoming someone of worth. With that blueprint, the scene is no longer about a map. It's about a character's soul. And the dialogue is no longer exposition either. It would become a high-stakes negotiation between two people with history and conflicting desires. What all this would lead to is that this no longer would be a story that happens to the hero. It would be the hero beginning to happen to the story. So you are not doomed to repeat the flawed process that caused the example scene. While the chaos of narrative anarchy, the discovering the story as you go, feels like an act of creative freedom, it is in truth nothing but a trap. But like any trap, it provokes a counter-reaction. But in this case, that reaction went too far and caused an entirely new problem. Now, in order to get into that problem, I'm sure we can easily agree on first that the chaos of narrative anarchy is terrifying. That feeling of being lost in your own story, of having a dozen beautiful but disconnected threads, that is a uniquely painful kind of creative vertigo. And so the reaction of many is perfectly logical, because this is a moment of taking it too far. Many writers correctly identify the enemy, which is chaos. But in their desperation, they choose the wrong weapon against that chaos. They flee from the swarm of narrative anarchy and run straight into the arms of a different kind of prison, the overly rigid paint-by-numbers formula. They discover the hero's journey not as Joseph Campbell's beautiful observation of archetypical psychology, but as a rigid 12-point checklist where they force their characters to refuse the call, even if it makes no sense for their personality. They turn to the industrialized beat sheets mythologies like Save the Cat, which originated in Hollywood screenwriting. In its original form, this system suggested hyper-specific targets like the inciting incident on page 12 and the break into Act 2 on page 25 of a screenplay. Now, while adaptations for novelists use percentages rather than exact pages, the underlying principle is still the same. A rigid formula that prioritizes chronology over character. It tells you when something should happen without ever asking why it matters. And the result is a manuscript that is structurally perfect, according to the spreadsheet, but completely dead on the page. These rigid formulas often treat story as a sequence of plot events to be executed, not an emotional and thematic journey to be architected. They are prisons of logic that leave no room for intuition, for discovery, for the very magic you set out to capture in the first place. Now, the real tragedy is that many writers embrace this flawed rebellion for the right reason. They were seeking the effortless power they sense in the masterworks of the genre, intuitively knowing that there had to be an underlying structure holding them together. And with that, they are not wrong. So instead of dissecting another failure, let me now perform an act of reverse engineering and analyze a scene that, in the hands of an amateur operating on a narrative anarchy, would have been an absolute catastrophe. But written by a master like J.R.R. Tolkien, it became one of the best fantasy scenes ever written. And it all plays out in Rivendell. Now the scene I want you to consider is the Council of Elrond from Tolkien's The Fellowship of the Ring. By all the rules of conventional writing advice, this chapter should not work. It is, on its surface, several pages of characters sitting in a circle and delivering exposition. They talk about ancient history, forgotten kings, and magical artifacts. The chapter is functionally a history lecture placed in the middle of an adventure story. If the author of our earlier tavern scene had written this, it would have been an unreadable, soul-crushing info dump. And yet, it is one of the most compelling and pivotal chapters in the entire fantasy canon. Why? Because Tolkien was not just a gardener discovering this scene as he went. While his process famously involved a great deal of discovery, the tale grew in the telling, as he put it himself. That organic growth was rooted in an unparalleled architectural foundation of history, language, and lore. Tolkien had built an entire universe already. He was a master who synthesized both impulses, making him a narrative architect. He had a blueprint for this scene, and that blueprint was not about plot, it was about pressure. The architectural goal that shines through clearly here is simple and devastating: to prove through character that every single powerful race and political entity in Middle-earth was fundamentally incapable of solving this problem. What Tolkien architected here was a situation where the combined military might of the elves, the stoic endurance of the dwarves, and the proud ambition of men all failed. And he does so in a way that avoids falling into the same pitfalls our made-up example presented. First, remember Tobin, our passive protagonist who was told his destiny? Now look at Frodo. When the council reaches its impasse, when the great and powerful have fallen into squabbling and fear, no one turns to Frodo and says, "You have a destiny to fulfill." No one tells him what to do. The silence just falls. The weight of the world's future hangs in the air. And then, Tolkien writes, a great dread fell on him, as if he was awaiting the pronouncement of some doom that he had long foreseen, and vainly hoped might after all never be spoken. An overwhelming longing to rest and remain at peace by Bilbo's side in Rivendell filled all his heart. At last, with an effort he spoke, and wondered to hear his own words as if some other will was using his small voice. "I will take the ring," he said, "though I do not know the way." This is the polar opposite of narrative impotence. This is character agency forged in fire. Notice the internal conflict laid bare on the page. Frodo's dread, his longing for peace, the feeling of another will using his voice. This is completely different from the smooth, frictionless plot delivery of the example tavern scene. Here we have a soul tearing itself in two. Frodo makes a choice, and that choice is a profound act of transformation in itself. In the language of my own teachings, this is his catalyst. The first active, irreversible choice that defines the protagonist's path. It is powerful precisely because it is a choice made against his own desire, for the good of others. Tolkien's story demanded a moment of pure, sacrificial volition, and he built the entire scene to serve as a crucible for that one decision. But next then, let's look at the issue of exposition. Remember Brenna, the walking Wikipedia article, who dumped 5 proper nouns in a single sentence? Well, in the Council of Elrond, every piece of information is delivered by a character with a clear conflicting agenda. This approach ensures what I call a powerful conflict triangle, which is made up of external conflict, interpersonal conflict, and internal conflict. For example, when Boromir, the proud son of Gondor, speaks, there is more to it than just delivering history about its people's fight against Mordor. He is making a political power play here. His desire is to claim the ring for Gondor, to use its power as a weapon. His exposition is a performance of strength, colored by arrogance. And this creates immediate interpersonal conflict with Aragorn, whose quiet humility is a direct rebuke to Boromir's pride, and with Elrond, who understands the ring's seductive evil. When then Glóin, the dwarf, speaks of a messenger from Sauron offering rings of power in exchange for information about hobbits, we are not presented with something simple as just another plot update either. Glóin is revealing the vulnerability and temptation his people are facing. He's there to seek counsel, but also to issue a warning which creates tension with the elves, giving the ancient grudge between the races. Every piece of lore and historical fact is weaponized in a character-driven debate. The external problem, the ring, is used to expose the interpersonal fractures, the mistrust between races, and the internal flaws, which include Boromir's pride, Gimli's prejudice, Frodo's fear. The information is not the point. The conflict the information generates is the point. Unlike Brenna's sterile info dump in the example scene, Nothing Tolkien wrote as part of the Council of Elrond scene is neutral. It's all ammunition. What you are witnessing is the work of a master architect who built the container first, however conscious that was. Tolkien already knew the thematic core of his story, that the smallest, most humble creatures can triumph where the proud and powerful fail. The Council of Elrond is the architectural proof of that thesis. In this scene, Tolkien systematically disqualifies every obvious hero. The elves are too wary and ready to leave the world. The dwarves are too greedy and insular. The men of Gondor are too proud and susceptible to the ring's temptations. Only when the story deliberately has demonstrated the failure of all these powerful candidates does it create the vacuum that only Frodo can fill. Frodo's choice is the thematic heart of the entire novel, made manifest in a single terrifying decision. The effortless flowing beauty of that scene is a magnificent illusion. This is the product of a staggering amount of invisible architectural work, a blueprint that prioritized character choice, thematic resonance, and the strategic layering of conflict. Now, the flawed rebellion against the myth of effortless genius would have you believe that the solution is rigid formula. But much of the advice you can find online and elsewhere only focuses on the external plot. As presented earlier with things like Save the Cat or other processes, it would tell you to put an inciting incident on page 12 and a debate sequence in the middle of Act 1, but it would never tell you why. It wouldn't force you to answer the foundational architectural questions. A formula tells you what to write on page 50, but that is tyranny. A proper blueprint tells you why the character arcs on page 50 and lets you find out what they actually do. That is psychology. My own writing philosophy doesn't demand you hit a particular beat at a specific time. It demands you answer questions that define a character's transformation. And that transformation, the character's arc throughout the novel, that is what defines the what on the page. The difference between the Dead Tavern scene and the Council of Elrond is the presence of clarity within a writer who's concerned with the story's soul, not just its skeleton. It's the difference between telling your reader what happened and making them a participant in a moment of profound world-altering choice. Poor planning can be just as devastating as no planning at all. But as you can see now, the right planning is what created the conditions for Tolkien's genius to shine. So where does this leave you? You have seen the swarm of narrative anarchy, the chaotic, intuitive path that so often ends in a beautiful ruin, at best. And you have heard about the sterile prisoner formula, the soulless, paint-by-numbers path that produces a perfect corpse. One promises a freedom it cannot sustain, and the other offers a certainty that kills the very thing you love. It feels like an impossible choice. A choice between two different kinds of failure. And this is the very heart of the problem. You have been led to believe that this is a choice you must make, but what appears to be a choice between two paths is in fact the two walls of a single trap. You're not choosing between being a gardener or an architect, a panther or a plotter. You're being forced to oscillate between two broken models, both built on the foundational lie that structure and intuition are enemies. One model tells you to abandon the blueprint for the sake of the seed. The other tells you to abandon the seed for the sake of the blueprint. Both are recipes for a barren garden. I know the acute personal pain of this trap. Not because I've studied it from a distance, which I did, but because for years I've lived inside it. You begin a project with a romantic ideal of the gardener. This time you tell yourself, I'll just let it flow. I won't constrain the magic. You write your first 10, 20, maybe 30,000 words. The world is exciting, the characters are alive. It feels like channeling something divine. But then you hit that inevitable wall, and the pain of that failure pushes you to the other extreme. So for the next attempt, you swing violently toward the rigid plotter. You seek refuge from the chaos only to feel like a factory worker on an assembly line, not an artist. And the ultimate result of all this is what you tell yourself. You conclude that the failure must be yours. That you decide the lack raw mystical talent of the gardener, and you lack the rigorous intellectual discipline of the plotter. You start to believe that finishing a novel of the scope and emotional depth you dream of is for other people. People who are more gifted, more organized, more brilliant. People who have the magic. This self-blame is the final most elegant feature of this entire trap. It keeps you focused on your own perceived inadequacies, preventing you from ever questioning the foundational lie that built your prison. It ensures you remain a frustrated amateur forever seeking the next piece of contradictory advice instead of becoming the professional architect of your own work. This is what keeps your best stories locked in your heart instead of finished, bound, and placed in the hands of a reader where it belongs. And this is utterly painful. But now that you see the trap, now that you understand intellectually that the choice between the swamp of narrative anarchy and the prison of rigid plot formula is no choice at all, you have to move beyond that, because understanding is not enough. To know you are in a prison is one thing, To escape it requires a conscious, difficult, and profoundly uncomfortable act of will. It requires you to stop blaming yourself for the failure of a broken system and to start taking responsibility for building a better one. Because I have to tell you a hard truth. The refusal to learn and implement a sound architectural process is not, as you may have told yourself, a noble defense of artistic intuition. It is a form of intellectual cowardice. It is the fear that if you create a detailed blueprint, if you do the rigorous intellectual work of building a sound structure and the story still doesn't work, then you will have no one left to blame. You will have to face the terrifying possibility that the idea itself was flawed, or that you actually still need to learn and grow more. By sticking to the myth of the effortless genius, you hold on to a permanent excuse. You can avoid all this. You can always say, the muse just didn't show up, or I lost the feeling. It allows you to protect your ego by blaming a mystical external force for a concrete internal failure of craft. Adopting the discipline of a narrative architect strips that excuse away. It makes you accountable to your own story. And that is a terrifying prospect. But as you have seen, a story without a deliberately constructed architecture to support it will almost always collapse under the weight of its own ambition. What you have to understand is that the story that haunts you, the one whose core image is burned into the back of your mind, the one that feels more true than your own memories at times, it does not belong to you. You are not its owner, you are just its custodian. It chose you, out of all the minds in the world, as the vessel through which it might enter reality. That is a profound and sacred trust. And you owe it more than your vague romantic notions of letting it flow. You owe it your competence. You owe it your rigor. You owe it an architecture worthy of the vision. I'm pretty sure that you would not hire a contractor who showed up to build your house and said, I don't use blueprints. I'm just going to feel the vibe of the wood and discover the house as I go. More likely than not, you would throw that person off your property. Why then would you accept a lower standard of professionalism for the story you are trying to build from your heart? What I'm saying here is that there is a moral imperative. If you actually want to do your story justice, if this narrative is something with profound meaning to you, then you must stop treating your writing like a hobby, a self-indulgence where the only thing that matters is how you feel in the moment of creation. Instead, you must start treating it as a craft, a high-stakes profession where your responsibility is to the integrity of the finished work. The real path is not to choose between intuition and structure, but to create a grand synthesis of the two. You're not a gardener or a plotter. You're a creator who needs both the living seed of an idea and the architectural blueprint for the greenhouse that will protect it, nurture it, and allow it to grow to its fullest height. The fear that a plan will kill the magic comes from a fundamental misunderstanding of what that magic is. Because the magic is not in discovering whether your hero turns left or right at the fork in the road. That is just plotting. The true breathtaking magic is in discovering your character's soul under the pressure you have deliberately architectured for them. The magic is in the unexpected line of dialogue that reveals a hidden wound. It is in the moment a minor character suddenly does something astonishingly brave. A blueprint does not prevent this kind of discovery. It creates the conditions for it. By making the big load-bearing decisions up front, you liberate your creative subconsciousness to play, to invent, to surprise you within the sturdy walls of a sound structure. I can only emphasize it one more time here. Structure is not the enemy of magic. Structure is the vessel that allows magic to survive the journey from your heart to the page. So it is time to make a choice. You can remain in the comfortable prison of self-blame and romantic myths, producing a folder of beautiful tragic fragments, or you can accept the professional responsibility you owe to your story. You can do the hard, unglamorous, and deeply rewarding work of becoming its architect. Narrative architecture is not a rigid formula. It is a philosophy of creation that puts the emotional and thematic core of your story at the center of the process. You practice it by codifying your story's soul before you lay the first break of prose. Ultimately, it is about understanding the fundamental why of your story so that every what you write, every scene, every character, every line of dialogue, they all serve that deeper purpose. Now, for years, I have struggled with the same challenges you are facing until I embraced this truth. Since then, I have worked with many writers just like you, guiding them out of the swamp and helping them build their cathedrals. From that work and my own writing, I have codified the principles of narrative architecture into a single comprehensive tool, one I've called the complete system for writing your fantasy novel. It is a process I wish someone had given me years ago when my own folder of failed drafts was overflowing. And it's a process I now use myself for every novel I write, including my currently planned duology featuring The Fugitive Prince and The Rebel King, both planned to be released this year. The system I've developed is a specific set of diagnostic and creative steps designed to help you excavate and codify your story's DNA before you commit hundreds of hours to writing a draft. And if you're ready to follow this process for yourself, you can find out more via the link in the description below. Now, the choice of which tool to use is ultimately yours, but the choice to finally adopt a professional process is a non-negotiable step if you're serious about finishing your book. The myth of the effortless genius is designed to keep you a perpetual amateur. It wants you to believe your success or failure is determined by a mystical force you cannot control, by absolving you of the responsibility of true craftsmanship. It is the most comfortable, seductive, and destructive lie in the creative world. Do not let it kill your story too. Writing a fantasy novel is not magic. And it isn't a mystery. It's just craft. Simple as that. And if you're ready to learn that craft, your work begins now. Click here to watch this video next, where I will show you exactly how to build the emotional spine of your entire novel, your protagonist's complete transformation, using just 15 foundational scenes.